I
So
don't know if
what's
that's
the
on
hot button
here.
issue? That Gemini's biased.
Yes. Well, I think it's the Gemini is biased as one, but two would just be that AI in general is biased.
Well,
And
people are,
like, what's the solution to that, right? And like that's that's an interesting discussion that I don't think anybody actually wants to have.
yeah,
Yeah, the only reason I wouldn't want to have that discussion is because I feel like it's boring. Like I don't know if there's ever if there's a solve to that. Is there a solution to that?
Well, yeah, the solution's easy. You have to make an unbiased society.
oof. Oh, that'll be easy.
Do you want to lead that one?
Well, the reality is there's no such thing as unbiased person. There's no such thing as unbiased news source. There's no such thing as unbiased report. Like, there's no such thing as unbiased science. Like, everybody has an angle. Everybody has influences. Everybody has, reasons, good or bad or indifferent, for doing things. And to say, hey, we can make AI that's unbiased is, well, it's kind of ridiculous. Like, so the matter is more of what level of bias is acceptable. So I'll give you a few examples. So there's a lot of issue with, okay, we'll do the simplest one. 2008, I think it was. Chuck, you might know better the date. It was around there, 2010. It was when Google first released Google Photos and it could identify people. And the one guy revealed that his friend, an African American, was identified as a gorilla by the algorithm.
Yeah.
Twitter, and so basically Google just instantly shut it down for like 3 or 4 or 5 years. I'm not sure how long. You just could not label anything as essentially a gorilla, a chimp, a monkey. Like there just was no identification of that in their algorithm at all. Well, clearly that is an unacceptable and terrible bias that should not be in the system, right? And so I think turning it off until you could fix it was probably the best thing they could do. Because if they couldn't fix it, like they didn't have a way to do that, um, all right, fine. It seems like it wouldn't be that hard, but maybe I just misunderstand the tech at that time to fix the issue. You just train it on pictures of people and you train it on pictures of animals and you tell them the difference. Like it seems like it's easier to fix than they made it out to be, but I think they were just so gun shy. They didn't want like 1 in 1,000 to be wrong, you know? And so, okay, fair enough. But now the issue is more like, okay, show me a picture of a CEO or show me 5 pictures of CEOs. And they have all this diversity, right? Different skin colors, some are women, some are men, whatever. And so they're trying to show, okay, this we're being unbiased. Well, if you actually go and look at the pictures of the CEOs of, let's say, Fortune 100 companies, they're not quite that diverse. Now, there is some diversity. There's people of different colors, and there's women, and there's whatever, but you're like 80-20 to a certain person, right? Like old white guys to some degree. Maybe not 80% now, I'd have to go with the actual numbers, but it's still the majority. So if you asked it to generate five, and each one is you have an Indian and you have a Chinese and you have a white guy and you have somebody's African American and so on, is that biased? Well, the answer is yes, because the data set itself doesn't reflect that 20% of each. And so what you're actually saying is we want bias, but we want bias that reflects the bias we value, not the bias of reality, right? But so then the issue I think recently with Gemini was, okay, generate images of, I think it was like Nazi commanders,
Mhm.
something like that, Nazi SS, and it did what you wanted it to do with the CEOs. It showed people from different, you know, demographic backgrounds. And so just like it took the CEOs and made them diverse, it took the Nazi soldiers and made them diverse, which isn't obviously historically accurate. And so now it's like, okay, well, in this area, we want a bias built into the system that doesn't reflect reality. But in this other area, we don't want any bias. We want it to reflect reality. And so how do you ever police that? Like, there's a billion different inputs and questions of like, hey, I want a picture of teachers. I want a picture of a nurse. I want a picture of, whatever else. And the reality of, you know, 85% of teachers being women or something like that. or 80% of nurses being female, and then generating this half men, half women, well, that would be a bias, right?
I'm
And
going to push you
so
here, Brian. So you're writing a book about this, so you should have the answer. But to me, it seems like AI, as with more things, if we're talking about progression of us as a species, we need to be obviously we need to be inclusive. Right? So we need to look at the full picture, which is what you're saying. But we also need to reflect reality as well. So that's really difficult. Like it shouldn't be. Like it should be really easy. But it's really difficult because you're taking into account also humanity, and humanity isn't straightforward. It's usually not reasonable or rational. So, like, what's the answer?
so the book does not address bias at all. So that is
Book two.
not part of what we're that level of depth. We're starting to think at more foundational levels, the things we're addressing, but it's just something that is on people's mind. So the solution is you have to create a society that isn't biased. Now, the reality is that's just not possible, right? Like the fact that more women show compassion and caring and so wants to care for people in nursing professions or as teachers or whatever else. I don't know why that is a bad thing. Like that seems like okay, if that's what you want to do, if you have the freedom to choose that, nobody's forcing you to do so, that's good, right? Um, and there's various research on these types of things that shows that's normal. Now, if I'm a construction worker and I'm lifting heavy things and I'm a guy and I have the freedom to either be a teacher or a construction worker, but I choose to be the construction worker, like that reflection of reality isn't a bad thing as long as we all have the opportunities to choose whichever one, whether that's being a nurse or being the construction worker. So when you then tell AI, hey, I want to make this inclusive, how deep do you go with that? Right? Like, and then who defines that? So if I said, generate an image of an NFL running back, of which somewhere around 98% are black, and it generates, one black and one white guy, it's like, well, that's biased. Is that good? Is that what we want? And I don't know that I have the answers to that. The question of who controls what is acceptable bias and what is not acceptable bias is a big factor. But for anybody that says, hey, it should be unbiased, well, that's just someone that doesn't understand reality. Like,
Who should control it? Should it be the government? Should it be the people that own these tech companies? Like, should it be democratic? Should people have a vote in this? Like, should tech be treated like a government? Who should decide what is and isn't reasonable?
who should? There's a should and there's a what's really going to happen.
Let's do the
Um,
should first.
See, well, one of the interesting things about the large language models and what we're seeing develop over time is like the biggest models, your ChatGPTs and Claudes and Geminis, have been trained on all the data, right? Like essentially everything that's recorded. Let's be honest, a lot of our intelligence about what your spouse likes or your children likes, or what I know about Chuck is not written down anywhere. So that's just recorded knowledge. But let's ignore that for a second. All written knowledge, the some degree video knowledge and things, it's out there. It's already trained in the models. That's not now a competitive advantage. But I can take those trained models, their algorithms, and apply them to local data sets. And I think that's what's going to have to happen, which means anybody can train a data set on anything. So if I don't like the fact that Gemini will not generate a presentation or help me generate a presentation that says evolution renders God redundant, he's no longer needed. And it also won't help me make a presentation that says the 5 miracles every atheist accepts, because both of those are too biased for it or too offensive. Somebody else is going to make an LLM that lets me do that. Right. And I think it ends up being a competitive landscape to some degree. Now, will it have they have the resources of Gemini or ChatGPT? Probably not. And that becomes a difficult thing. How you would ever sit down and have a committee in a document that said, okay, this is the acceptable bias. We want CEOs to be diverse. We want nurses to be diverse. We want slave owners to not be diverse. We want Nazis to not be diverse. Like, I don't think you could ever define that. Like, how would you? Like,
But why
oh,
not? Like we have the Convention on Human Rights. You know, we managed to agree on those basic principles. So why is this any different?
well, if you look at the Declaration of Human Rights, I've read through all of those. Those have nothing to do with these things, right? So the way somebody looks is not really referenced in there because it doesn't matter. It's right that's not a factor that should be relevant to anything. What matters is what people do, and what people say, and how people act, not how they look. And so the whole point of the human rights is that's irrelevant, right? That we're all equal. Why are we all equal? Because we're made in the likeness of God. Like that's the core reason we're all equal. There's no other definition that can give you equality. And so when you start nitpicking and saying, okay, well, if I said give me a picture of a warlord and it shows me the Chinese Mongols, which were clearly warlords, maybe the most murderous warlords in the history of the world, that's just, I mean, maybe we can debate it, but there probably isn't much debate there. Like, that's pretty well established historical fact. And people from China are upset, like, hey, that's biased that you're having pictures of warlords that look like, Chinese people. Well, is it or not? You know, who gets to say that that's offensive and we shouldn't, reference history accurately in that regard? Now, could you have nuance to it? Well, okay, they're not the only warlords. Yeah, that's absolutely true. They're certainly not the only warlords. We also have warlords from pretty much every continent and most other places. But if you said the most prolific or the ones that killed the highest percentage of people they attacked, that one would be the hard one to overcome. Um, I don't think you could ever develop a committee that would come to an answer, right? It's
So it
like
sounds
developing a
like
committee, Rob, that decided on the best song ever.
Ooh.
Like, what committee has the authority to do that? That's just not something that's reasonable or possible, I don't believe.
It's a
so
foul.
and so Chuck, feel free to jump in on this one as well. From what I'm hearing, it sounds like you think that it shouldn't something like AI to take out bias or to try and strip out bias as much as we possibly can from AI. It shouldn't have one particular oversight. It's just going to be more of a democratic process where more people filter towards the model that they feel represents them the best. That's what you think is going to happen and what you think should happen.
Yeah, and I would say there's a few very clear limits though, which we should all absolutely agree on. If I have the ability to use an AI model to look at, you know, children in indecent positions and things like this, I've heard of, I can't say that I've verified this, but I believe it's true. If you take a picture of a person of any age and you feed it into the AI model, it'll undress them, right? Like that sort of thing isn't a bias, but it is something we should not allow, right? Like if I'm a
Well,
pedophile, I shouldn't be able to just go get a picture of some kid off of their parents' Facebook page and feed it an algorithm and see what they look like naked.
I'm pretty sure here in the States we already have laws against doing stuff like that. I mean,
Good.
fine, fine line. I don't know that we
Yeah,
need.
there one of the big data sets, Chuck, I can't remember the name of it, but I could find it. Found, and this is a data set of billions and billions, maybe trillion images. They did find over 3,000 child pornography images in their data set. And so they found it, they're trying to address it, and that's what absolutely should happen. So there should be certain limits. Is it illegal, Chuck, for me to take a picture of you and use AI to make that naked and then pass it around the office? I don't know.
Could be, it could be defamation, or it could be harassment, or it could fall under several different laws. It really depends on the situation itself.
Yeah.
I mean, if
Well,
you're a painter and you painted somebody naked, it'd be the same thing. It doesn't matter if it was done with AI or if you did it with a paintbrush. It's the same issue, the same problem. Just because AI makes something faster and easier to do, I mean, I could do it with Photoshop too. In fact, they do it on with Photoshop all the time. They used to.
it's refreshing. My guess then is something you said earlier, which is, or previously in one of our discussions, that just needs to be enforced, right?
Yeah, we really do need to start enforcing a lot of the laws we have rather than creating new legislation. I mean, I think that's just a waste of time and money. Let's go after the big bads that we already have out there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me as well. So, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know where that line draws, but I don't see how you could ever create an unbiased system. Yeah, the example I gave where it wouldn't support atheist arguments or theist arguments, like, hey, that's just offensive. Like, what? Like, you're trying to tell me what I'm allowed to think?
Yeah,
Is
see,
that where we want to go? Like, that's way too 1984, thought police. I feel like people are just going to abandon Gemini and they're just not going to use it if that's where you're
look
at, right?
on Reddit, it gets lots of hate, man. It gets a lot.
Gemini does.
Yeah.
And
It does.
I haven't tried that test with ChatGPT.
No, I've played
Well,
check. You gotta push. You gotta push, but you can get it to do all kinds of things. Grok, you really don't have to push too hard, and it will do things for you pretty
I
open.
guess, yeah, let me correct that. I did actually try that on custom GPTs, and I was able to get it to help me with the custom GPTs, but it was easier with the custom GPT versus just a
Yeah.
generic chat. That seems like the guardrails move when you use a custom GPT, which Gemini doesn't have yet, at least not that I'm aware of.
all right, so I want to circle back to Gemini there. And just before I do, Brian, I don't know if you could just adjust your camera slightly, like angle it slightly further down, because it's literally here. Yeah. Yeah, that's better. So I just want to touch on Gemini. So you and Greg on Pi Image Search. I'll let you pitch that, and hopefully the AI picks it up and clips it nicely. But you can explain what Pi Image Search is. But you said that some of the people working there think that Gemini's biased. Like, I guess the first question then is, kind of taking into account what we've already spoken, why is that a problem to what they're doing at Pi Image Search? Why is Gemini being biased in whatever way it is a problem to Pi Image Search?
So the feedback was from a customer of Pi Image Search. So Pi Image Search is the number one resource in the world for computer vision training. So we have well over 500 articles, the vast majority of which have examples of code and working code that you can use and learn from to do computer vision, OpenCV, and all the tools around that. And if you're not familiar with computer vision, it's real simple. It's how do we take image, video, picture, and get information out of that, whether it's identifying that image or so on. So this dates back 8 or 9 years. I think we have 9 years worth of weekly blogs. So do the math on that, and then sometimes biweekly, and then training courses and so on around that. So the feedback from a customer was essentially, hey, we shouldn't be promoting Gemini because we talk about it and we write some articles about it. I don't think we promote it more than just saying this is what it is and that's what's there, whether you use that or Claude or Mistral or whatever. We haven't addressed all those to be fair. So maybe it was just we were giving it more press. You shouldn't be doing that because it's biased. And it's like, well, what isn't biased? Like, really, what you're saying is it's more biased than I would like it to be, or it's biased in particular areas that I'm not comfortable with, right? And that could be a fair critique, sure. I just don't know how you solve that in any reasonable fashion without just neutering it completely. And there's talk on that other end as well that okay, they just neutered the program so much that I can't get any useful information out of it because it's just trying to whitewash everything in such a way. That probably wasn't ideal word usage, but I mean, in the terms of just cleanse it is how I'm using that terminology. That it doesn't, it's going to limit what usefulness that you're going to get from it, right? And it gets weird, right? Like if I said generate images of, I don't know, 15th century British monarch, and generate 10 of those, and there's one that's from an Asian culture, and there's one from Africa, and there's one from South America, and it's like, well, that's not historically accurate, but it is diverse. Is that what we want? Like, do we want it to be accurate, or do you want it to represent something else? Right. And the same applies anywhere else. Like, show me a 15th century, Chinese leader, right, from whatever dynasty. Okay, are we going to show people that look like the people that lived then? Or are we going to show a diversity of people and do that in Africa? And do that. So, like, it doesn't matter which area you're taking from. Do we want it to be no matter what I'm asking for, I want to show a diversity of people, or do I want it to show something that's accurate to that time period? And I feel like people don't want the accuracy, they want inclusiveness, but in reality, you're actually just creating the bias. You're programming bias into the system to be biased against the history.
So, Brian, this isn't just a problem when you're looking at historical stuff. I mean, we work in marketing, and this is a huge problem for marketing because if you're trying to get a message out to a wide range of people, you're trying to get your consumer base. If you have built-in biases that ignore what your actual demographics are, then it makes it extremely difficult to be able to create
Sure.
any kind of copy or any kind of images or anything that relates to that actual group of people. And I think that's the bigger issue for companies right now. How can you trust a tool like Gemini if you're working in marketing and you want to have, actual copy and stuff that hits that group of people? A suburb in Detroit is quite different from a suburb in Louisiana. Maybe those people are culturally somewhat related, but those are definitely different areas. There's definitely, Cajun stew down there, and then you know what I'm saying? You have totally different areas. So it's not all about race or things like that. It's about where people live. And when you start building in these biases that just are completely unrealistic, I mean, you can't use Gemini for anything involving reality right now because it lives in a fantasy world that doesn't exist. I know
Yeah.
we want to have this world of equality where everybody has equity, but it's not real. That's not a real world. We're not all equal. There are people who can run really fast, and then there's people like me who can barely get up out of my chair and go out the front door. We are individuals and we're unique. And when you start building these systems to make everybody the same, like we're all ticky tacky, all in the same little boxes, it ignores reality. And then you can't use these tools for things in the real world. And that's what we want to do. This whole conversation is all about being kind to one another. That's what it's about. It's about the golden rule. It's about common human decency. That's not the kind of thing you legislate. That's the kind of thing you spread from one person to another. Now, as far as these bots, all we need to do is put the laws into them. If you're operating in the United States, then you should definitely be following the laws of the United States. If you're in France, you should definitely be following the laws in France. If you're releasing these tools worldwide, as a company, you're probably making a mistake if you're not making sure that you're following all the laws of the country that you're in. This isn't about ethics. It isn't about race. This is all about just following the laws. If the laws are ethical, then there's no problem. Have the models trained on the laws. Problem solved.
Well, the challenge I think is whichever bias you go, right? I want it to be accurate, that's a bias, or I want it to be diverse, that's a bias. I don't think there's any laws around that. I think you could do either one, right?
Good, you could. I don't believe we should have legislation that locks these things down.
I don't think you could. I don't even know what it would say. Like, what would be the,
Ask China because they're going to try. They're going to come up with something. They're going to lock it down as tight as they possibly can. But I don't think that's the right move. We don't lock down the companies that are building these things. We just make them follow the existing laws. Maybe we have to tweak some of those laws, but I think we've already got most of this covered. You know, I don't think we need to go through this huge, huge thing in Congress with all these hearings and people are talking about the evils of AI and how it's going to blow up the world and everything. Look, if you've got an AI system and you're hooking it up so that it can blow up the world, I'm pretty sure that there's some laws you've broken there somewhere around the way. I don't think we need to have new legislation for that, right? Do we need to have congressional hearings over that? I don't really think so.
Okay,
oh,
so I'm going to take this on a slightly different path to sort of lead us to an end here, but just comparing the two, because we use ChatGPT all the time at Optimized Marketing, like every day, multiple times a day across the team. We talk about Gemini, but I think only a couple of us. I think Chuck, you're definitely one of them. Maybe Greg. Not many of us are using Gemini. So if we're talking about solely about bias and about the problems it can cause us as a marketing agency when we're creating images or copy, which one is more biased, Gemini or ChatGPT?
Gemini.
I'm not sure how to quantify something like that.
Which one would
It's
you
like,
prefer to work with as a result of, well, I'm more likely to get an accurate image from this rather than one that is diverse, or I'm more likely to get copy that speaks to the people that I'm writing for in this particular demographic rather than something that speaks to everybody and doesn't offend anybody.
it's like asking your office or my office which one has more air in it. It's like, well, there might be different things in the air, but the volume is storing the same amount.
People want to
What's
know
going
this
to give you
stuff
more
though. Like
accurate?
we're looking for a recommendation.
Yeah, I mean, Gemini just hasn't been good or useful for me, and maybe that's for you, Chuck, for like generating images at all.
Oh no.
Um, my testing, and I'll
Well,
probably do a separate video on this, has shown um, what appears to me to be a rather anti-Christian bias. And I have a few examples of that I've recorded and can go through. In Gemini, I don't see it at the same level on GPT, but GPT has biases in other areas, particularly if you use custom GPTs. You can go, let's say, more biased pro choice. You cannot go very biased pro life. It kind of just cuts you off, which was interesting. So it would depend on what you're doing. But image generation for me, Gemini hasn't helped at all, so I don't even use it anymore. I haven't seen many issues with the images that most of the images that we're generating, at least that I've been working on, are just like robots and things. So, they're relatively neutral, I think. But I guess if I had to say which one seems to be, see, the question is Gemini more or less biased because it's not only giving us truth, right? I think it's less accurate. Does
yeah.
that mean it's more or less biased though? I don't know that you can quantify it that way.
What do you think, Chuck?
Well, I'll tell you, if we're talking about image generation, you should be looking at Runway and Midjourney. Those two tools are amazing. Anything coming out of OpenAI and Google is just it pales in comparison to any of that stuff. Um, I don't know, man. I don't know as far as bias and stuff. If you think of the bots as being like people, okay, you could think of Gemini as being that self-righteous asshole that nobody really wants to hang out with because every time you say anything, it has an opinion on it. And you're definitely wrong. And you need to get your stuff sorted out because you need to think about that. You could offend somebody doing something like that. So in my opinion, Gemini is probably one of the more offensive tools out there on the market. I mean, if you want to get offended and get triggered, hop on to Gemini because it is so twisted up in its logic and stuff. That's not the real world in any way, shape, and or form. It's definitely not the kind of person I would hang out with. If you look at ChatGPT and think of it as a person, it's more like that high school kid who thinks he knows everything, but is willing to at least listen. You can at least pose an argument and have a conversation about it. Sometimes you can convince it, sometimes you can't. Now, if you're talking about Grok is kind of like that dude he's down to clown with anything. I mean, really, honestly, doesn't matter, doesn't matter at all. Probably the coolest guy to hang out with out of the entire three. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. I haven't played with Grok, but I feel like, and this might lead to my next question. With all of this, it seems like there is a pain point in that you're either not getting historically or factually accurate stuff from today from some of these systems as a result of their bias, which means that that can cause problems for a big market of people like agencies. Anyone who wants to put anything on the internet essentially needs to fact check it themselves right now because they're getting stuff that might not be true or appeals to a certain bias but not to another. So it might not be helpful. So we've got a pain, we've got a market. Like all I see is opportunity. So does that mean that there's room for a challenger to come in and do something that actually works and addresses all these issues? Or is it just not possible because they're so far behind already? What do you guys think about that?
So Chuck and I might have different answers. So yes, I do think there's always room for a challenger. I mean, look at what Microsoft's done with OpenAI and kind of, displaced the 800-pound gorilla of Google. So, I mean, that's the beauty of technology that you can jump to the head of the pack, even with an entrenched leader. So it's always possible. Whether that's going to happen, I don't know. The challenge with AI, and this is a vast oversimplification, right? So you have your algorithm, you have your data set, and then you have your objective function. If we're all working with the same data set, which is the internet, all you're doing is tweaking the objective function. And then somebody with a third, from a third party is saying, well, this is offensive, this is not offensive, this is not what I want you to say, this is what I want you to say, and so on, right? And so that's the person kind of dialing the levers. When you go to say, okay, well, I want accurate information in my data set, well, that becomes a really challenging thing because, I mean, it's like the old saying goes, history is based on whoever, wins. They get the right to history. And so if I have 5 articles that have a certain viewpoint on a situation, let's like super polarizing, let's say it's like, the conflict in Gaza right now. The fact that 5 of them make a viewpoint and one of them makes a counterpoint, that doesn't mean the 5 are accurate, right? Like that doesn't mean 5 is reality. It just means it's a larger number.
Mm.
And this is like the whole SEO game and so on. But that's the problem with the data set, that the quantity that I'm going to say, oh, well, 5 people said X or Y or Z, therefore it must be the truth. Well, that gets really scary because that's not how we discern truth. At least it certainly shouldn't be. Looks like this thing raised my hand for me. That was
Whoa.
curious. And science is kind of the opposite, right? What do we see in science? Well, everybody believes something until somebody proves them wrong, right? And certainly they're built on years or centuries of information, but it's generally 1 or 2 experiments that kind of get people down this road that says, oh yeah, we've been looking at Newtonian mechanics all wrong. It's really about relativity, or wait, relativity is crazy. Look at quantum mechanics, or like it's not all of a sudden all the scientists get up one day and say, yep, it's now relativity, and it's like it's a battle to displace who's there. And that's how truth should be found. It should be uncomfortable. I mean, maybe it shouldn't be, but it is uncomfortable. That's reality. And so when you look at history, do you really want a large language model that's basing it on popularity, right? What's most popularly said versus what's accurate? And again, how do you do something else? So if I'm trying to come up with an accurate LLM, and this is where truth, what does he call X.AI, Elon Musk's thing, I find it to be quite ironic. And that's probably a whole other discussion, but how do you find truth when you're working on the same data set?
Mm-hmm.
Like there is no truth there. It's like whatever objective function you're tweaking at the end, which means your bias you're programming into the system. You're not removing bias. If you want to remove bias, you put nothing on there. You just let it go on the internet. And then what's it biased by? It's biased by what's most popular. Then it's probably like porn or something like that. Right. And that's what is reality. Which gets even more scary. But if that's what you do, I don't know how you get away from it. It's either at the end at the objective functions or the core objectives, which means whatever small cabal of people control it, or it's in the data set, which is whatever the democracy of the internet decides is most interesting, not what's most accurate.
Cats,
Chuck, what do you
cat
think?
videos. Yeah, Chuck, do you want to close this out?
Yeah, well, okay, real quick. We Brian, you mentioned Microsoft, but you know what? We haven't even talked about Claude or Anthropic at all. Somehow we gigantic models sitting back there. And of all the models that are out there that are impressive that I would like to spend more time with, probably Claude. Because I have seen some really impressive stuff on that, but not enough to really give a solid opinion. Um, One thing I do want to say though, if we really want to see what kind of world we're building, I would suggest everybody take a look at a sci-fi novel written by Craig Falconer about 6 or 7 years ago. He's out of the UK and it's called Seed. And I'll tell you what, it's pretty amazing, and it will give you an idea of what kind of world we are building, especially with some of the AR technology that's coming out. It's frightening.
Interesting. It's a fiction or non-fiction?
It's fiction. It's definitely fiction. But I'll tell you what, Rob, I've found in my life that you can find a lot of very interesting things about the real world in fiction. I mean, it's fiction, but a lot of times that you can get some satire in there or get some hidden messages across or make people think about things a little
Well,
bit.
at one point, 1984 was fiction.
Yeah, right. Ugh. Animal Farm too.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, let's try and make next week's call a happier one. I see there's a subject here, best case scenario for AI. Maybe we could talk about that next week.
Ooh.
All
Sounds
right.
good.
I think we're good. Brian, are we staying on for the let me just stop that recording.